Well, hello, everybody. My name is Town Peterson. This is our, I believe, eighth global online seminar in biodiversity informatics. Um, this is essentially the last Thursday of every month, and so we're glad to have you today. And please remember us a month from now, at the end of November. We'll be announcing that speaker and topic quite soon. Our speaker today is a valued colleague, Jeremy Kerr. Jeremy did his undergraduate work at the University of Ottawa and a PhD at York University, postdoced at Oxford University, and with some very eminent ecologists, Robert May and Dick Southwood. He then returned to the University of Ottawa, and he's now University Research Chair in Macroecology and Conservation. So I was very pleased when he accepted the invitation to give a talk today. And I've watched his work for years, and so it's a pleasure for me to be able to interact with Jeremy as well. Just a footnote is, if you have questions for Jeremy at the end of his talk, be certain to email them to biodivtraining@gmail.com, which is on the Google Plus page as well. But email those questions as promptly as you can, because I will then funnel them to Jeremy, and he can answer them live as part of the presentation. But you really do have to kind of get me those email questions quickly, or it's hard for me to pass them on to Jeremy. Anyhow, Jeremy, I'm going to pass this on to you, and thank you again for accepting the invitation.
Well, it's my pleasure to do this. It's a really unconventional, but I think excellent way to give a talk. I'm really glad to have the opportunity. Thank you very much for this. So I'm going to give a good try here to actually make my presentation begin so that people can actually see it. Town and I have rehearsed this, and it always works when we do it, but this will be the time when bugs appear. So without further ado, I'm going to just hope that you guys are now seeing the presentation. What I'm going to...
We are. It's looking good, Jeremy.
Oh, thank heavens. All right. So what I want to talk about today is some of the macroecological and global change and conservation research that I have been focusing on very hard for the last year or two, along with a team of people, some of whom are listed here as co-authors on this work, that is going to have as one of its underlying themes the use of data which has been accumulating in the quiet corners of the natural history world for a little more than a century, and as many other ecologists have also noticed, those data sets can prove to be sources of really critical insight into rapidly unfolding global change impacts on the distributions and abundances of species, but also can serve as the foundations to provide some new insights into things that I think should interest us as people also doing macroecology, not just the applied offshoots of macroecology at large scales like global change research. So what I'm going to talk about today will be a few different things, focusing on research on butterflies across Canada. I'm going to look at climate and habitat change impacts on the distributions of these species across this country, where I am right now, and it's cold here, so that's actually a theme that may be relevant to understanding something about butterflies in Canada. But also bumblebees, in terms of their distributional shifts over the last slightly more than a century across continents. And I'm going to focus on Europe and North America, where our understanding of how those shifts have unfolded is most clearly informed by the availability of very large, rather comprehensive data sets. I'm going to talk a little bit about how habitat change limits climate responses in Canadian butterflies and what we see as an impending or perhaps already unfolding and rather concerning interaction between climate change and land use change. And then I'm going to switch gears and talk about the results that we are overturning just now, or beginning to uncover just now, about how bumblebees are responding to climate change in the same sort of contexts, but over even broader scales across both Europe and North America. And I'll very briefly deal with implications. So, of course, among the foundational concepts in today's understanding of global change research is the clear recognition that anthropogenic climate changes have caused range shifts among species at global extents. We've seen this work repeatedly, and it is now, I think, about as sort of convincing as it could reasonably be that climate change causes geographical range shifts among species. Now, this is linking an environmental driver with a biological response, and between the biological response and environmental driver, there is a sort of a black box, which is like a kind of a gearbox for how global change creates these responses biologically. And so the precise eco-evolutionary mechanisms that are responsible for translating global change to biological response remain the subject of intense debate. But what I think is not particularly debated anymore, except in the halls of the climate change denial community, is that climate change causes range shifts. Now, those effects appear to be accelerating, but as yet, we have not observed widespread climate change-related extinctions. There is evidence that there are going to be negative impacts, and there is evidence that there are already negative impacts. But far more common than that is the observation that range expansions track shifting climates. Now, in contrast to what could be argued as a net positive for some species groups, although I think it's risky to make inferences about such things in that sort of way, there is no particular case to be made that habitat loss is good for species. So if you look at broad-scale trends in habitat loss, and here's a graph which shows one of the many possible ways of looking at this sort of issue, habitat loss causes extinction. And this is about as airtight, I think, a conservation lesson as we have from the science. But you can look at this sort of thing in, as I said, in many, many ways, and there's lots of research still going on about this kind of thing. But looking at things like the extent to which habitats have been modified away from their undisturbed state provides us some index into things like the rates at which species in those places will become endangered. This is from a study that we did a little while back on endangerment across Canada, and on the x-axis is measured the extent of modified habitat across Canada's ecozones. And there's about 15 of these terrestrial ecozones in Canada, rather big place. And on the y-axis is different numbers of species at risk, that is what the Americans call endangered species, within each of those ecozones. And it's just a very simple relationship showing that the more habitat is disturbed and changed from natural conditions to something like agriculture or cities, the more endangered species there are. And this is independent of all of the other factors that one might think affect numbers of species across a place like Canada. So habitat loss causes extinction, and that is, I think, a very uncontroversial statement. Now, in terms of the mechanisms governing climate change responses to species, I'll just say this, so these are the two major things, aspects of global change that I'm going to look at. I'm going to be looking at climate change and habitat loss and their interaction in terms of at least the butterfly research. So in terms of why species respond to climate change in the way that they do, and I'm thinking right now about butterflies, what we often see is that climate change, which in Canada is almost exclusively warming, reflects the reduction of climate-related barriers along their poleward range margins, and also what we'll colloquially refer to as their upper realized thermal niches. There's the boundaries in geographical space where these things can actually maintain populations. Along their equatorward range margins, we suspect that range losses should reflect the imposition of intolerable new climates. So things might become too hot, or things might become too dry. Climate change should also be causing losses among southern populations, not just expansions in northern populations. Now, because in Canada, most of the species that are present, their geographical ranges extend further south of the borders of the country. This is the same sort of thing that you might find in a study along the southern US borders, or indeed in places like southern England. Most of the species that are found there are also found in places further south in Europe, or in the case of the United States, further south in places like Mexico. Well, if we look at these things in Canada, most of the species here are found also further south in the United States. The result of all of this is that through time, species richness has generally increased as a function or in relationship with changing climates, because range expansion is causing species to move north, but it has not yet caused many species, southern populations apparently, to disappear. The risk is that, and this comes from work that was kind of elucidated very clearly in the 1980s by Peters and Darling, and then Peters, and a number of really interesting papers showing that climate change is likely to cause widespread range losses or range shifts. But habitat loss imposes barriers to dispersal. So the idea is here very simple, that climate change, in the initial context at least, was meant to sort of force species to move, while habitat loss was sort of meant to force them to stay in place, because it would be difficult to disperse through landscapes where those human-imposed barriers had been created. This is the theory, at least, and the idea is, at least theoretically, a kind of a charming one, and the question is, does it actually unfold like this? Now, parenthetically, let me also add just this, that in a place like Canada, this is a really weird country for any number of reasons, but one of those reasons is that we actually have a lot of wilderness left. There are not many places left on Earth like this. 2/3 of Canada consists of, meets a kind of a standard test for what is wilderness, and that is to say that there is no visible human disturbance in the landscape over around about 63 to 66 or so percent the geographical space of Canada. And Canada's 10 million square kilometers, so it's bigger than Western Europe, which means we have these big chunks of land where dispersal is not strongly inhibited by the imposition of those barriers. So one question that you could ask yourself is, are we seeing differences in rates of range expansion in places which are more or less free and have always been free of those human barriers to dispersal, relative to places where habitat losses are very intense? And in southern Canada, those habitat losses are no less intense than they are in places like southern England or agricultural regions in the United States. So we have both wilderness and intensively modified spaces, and a really large area over which to study those impacts. So with this work, what we're doing is we're using a massive long-term pollinator data set. And I say pollinators, but what I really mean here is butterflies in this first instance. And what we want to do here is figure out, relative to baseline conditions, are butterfly responses to global changes, and particularly climate change, more rapid in areas where the human footprint is really small? And as I mentioned, Canada has lots of places where that human footprint is really small in comparison with places where there is really intense habitat loss. So that's one of our motivating research questions here. In the second part of the talk today, I'm going to ask a different but quite related question, and that is to ask whether or not niche tracking and range boundaries of bumblebees across North America and Europe are following along with the shifting climatic conditions that we have observed there over the course especially of the last 39 or 40 years, where climate change is known to have accelerated quite a lot subsequent to about 1975. So thinking about the first part here in terms of butterflies, the obstacles to studying this question are huge. We don't have anywhere in the world, and this is irrespective of really noble attempts to model land use history, we don't have spatially detailed land cover change measurements that go back to an era prior to any detectable human impacts on climate. So if we're going to ask ourselves the question, does human modification of landscape interfere with climate shift sort of, or climate change driven responses, we don't have the ability to measure both climate change and habitat change over century timescales in a way that, for those of us who do also things like remote sensing, would seem satisfying. The other thing is that if you look at long-term shifts, the availability of spatially detailed observational data sets that extend through long periods of time and large geographical areas, those data sets remain really pretty uncommon in terms of the international science scene. There just isn't, you don't have an embarrassment of riches in terms of selecting which data sets you want to use. So these two things are challenges that we have thought about in terms of conducting this research and have developed some ways to address. The first of these is to deal with the land cover change problem. The massive map that you see on the, I think should be the right-hand side of your screen, shows human impacts relative to baseline conditions. So there's a lot of science that goes into constructing a data set like this, but what it basically shows is the anticipated values of integrated annual NDVI based on relatively high resolution satellite remote sensing data sets with respect to what those conditions should be if you removed the human footprint. So NDVI in Canada actually tracks climate really closely. And what you can do is predict what NDVI would be. You would add in all kinds of subsidiary factors, things like the soil conditions and the underlying geology and other factors that just kind of are part of the background here that would be a very long and distracting conversation. And then what you can do is measure then what the expectation is for NDVI, which is basically just a measure of productivity in a place like Canada, and then measure what it actually is and take the difference. This is the difference then between observed and predicted values of something like productivity across the Canadian landscape. And this map shows you what you get when you measure that difference. So the red bits are places where the human footprint is very deep. And these are places where productivity is considerably less, and that productivity is diverted to the human enterprise. In other places across Canada, where mostly it's kind of yellow or slightly green, these are places where productivity is more or less what you would expect it to be because there isn't much human footprint. But what you will see is that there are little dark green bits as well. These dark green bits in places like northwestern Canada are areas where climate changes have probably started to affect the distribution of vegetation, and indeed when you go and you look in these are places where there's a lot of vegetation green up. So you're getting higher biomass vegetation in those spots than traditionally was present. It used to be tundra, now it's shrubland. You see this thing especially commonly across the eastern lower Arctic in northern Quebec here, which is out on the right-hand side of the graph. If you look at that little chunk around that huge inland sea of Hudson's Bay, the green areas off in eastern Canada there are places where there is massive green up, and this is a function of increasing shrubland and so on. The point of all of this being, with a little bit of artful measurement, it is possible to come up with a reasonable measure of human impacts. And all of the places here that are dark red in southern Canada are clearly the bits where agricultural land uses are most intense, and we know this from any number. That's not a subtle point. We also have a huge amount of butterfly observations that we have assembled with many colleagues working diligently for a long time that show the distributions of species across at least much of the country for the past century or more. So we have a lot of data, and the two obstacles that I've shown on this screen, measurements of human impacts relative to baseline conditions, and measurements of biodiversity changes relative to baseline conditions, we can solve those problems, at least in large measure, in the ways that I've just described. And that's an unusual circumstance for us. Most of the time we have not been able to get around aspects, at least, of these problems. So here's what the biodiversity observations look like. You can't see anything like all of the data here because the layers are so deep for the most part. But the green blobs, of course, are places where collections have been made, and there's either one species observation in that place or many. And they are shown here for about 300 species, which sum to on the order of 250,000 or so observations that extend back to the late 19th century. This data set includes essentially every reliably georeferenced museum record for a Canadian specimen that we could find anywhere in the world, and a lot of people have been working on this, not just us. This also includes a lot of new observations from citizen science work and privately held historical databases that individual natural history people for butterflies have been collecting for a long time. So there's an awful lot going on under the hood in terms of these observations. And the first aspect, the first scientific work that we did with a much more primordial set of these data was with Dick Southwood back in 2001, where we looked at spatial variation of habitat conditions and its capacity to predict difference in biological communities of butterflies across Canada. But a lot of the citizen science observations here come from ebutterfly.org. Okay, so and just a reminder, this is our measurement of human footprint across Canada, showing really intense and deep human footprints in the south and relatively intact wilderness over the majority of the country. And if you dig into these places, you can zoom in to data sets of this sort in a lot of detail. You'll see some really amazing things, like places where the tar sands, for example, have been exploited, where the human footprint is pretty extraordinary, but it's actually rather small in a geographical sense. So we can put all of these measurements together. And what we did then was measure species numbers across Canada, climate trends across Canada, land use shifts in a historical time period relative to a recent time period. And what we expect here is that continuous habitat, places where the human footprint is more or less not present, should facilitate range expansion and allow richness differences to track climate changes faster. So this measuring biological difference there, using our measured differences in environmental factors to predict observed differences in species numbers across the country, of course, is the subject of a lot of statistical analysis. So there's, again, quite a lot going on under the hood here, and I'm going to summarize it for you rather briefly with a statistical table, which basically shows you the results from a series of spatial autoregressive models which test the hypothesis that land use change, that climate change, and the interaction of both of those things could have created differences in this biological response of species richness over Canada in the 20th century. And this is, just generally speaking, what it looks like. We used a nested hierarchical quadrat system that shows, in these instances, a consistent result regardless of the spatial resolution of that quadrat system. It can be 100 kilometers across, 200 kilometers across, or 400 kilometers across. And they basically always show the same sort of thing, and that thing is really straightforward, that warming allows butterfly species to expand their range. If you just look at that factor by itself, the human footprint, when you modify habitats away, particularly from forested conditions in southern Canada by itself, this has probably facilitated range expansion. When you put warming temperatures together with habitat loss, the result is consistently negative, and it's a rather substantial effect. And so if you measure things like the magnitude of these effects, I'm not especially interested in probability tests, but they're all statistically significant if you're concerned about such things, but the effect sizes are what I am most concerned with. The effect sizes here are reasonably good, and if we're measuring them, the Nagelkirch R² being one way to do this, you end up with ultimately the capacity to explain through time something like 74% of the spatial variation in butterfly species numbers as a function of climate conditions, human footprint, and the interaction of these two things. And so we have a temporally explicit measurement of how these aspects of environmental conditions affect species richness across this 10 million square kilometer space of Canada. So it's really a study which is on the scale of about Western Europe. And then what we can do is simply visualize those results to make them much more clear. This shows kind of an interesting sort of result, and that is that generally speaking, yes, species richness, the species numbers, which are here in red, that is high species numbers, versus blue, that is places with low species numbers. It looks like there's an enormous, of course, I shouldn't say it looks like, there are many more species in southern Canada than in northern Canada. So that's a blindingly obvious result that should surprise nobody at all. Butterflies really don't like living in the Arctic, for example. It's just not, there's no discovery in this. But what is interesting is that when you look at the difference in richness over the space of Canada from the early time period, which predates most anthropogenic climate change, relative to the late time period, that is 85 to 2010, which incorporates an enormous amount of anthropogenic climate change. The map on the right-hand side here shows the difference in species richness based on our statistical results, and then just projected into a mapping space so you can actually see what the statistics are showing you. Blue areas on the right-hand side here are places where richness has actually dropped a little bit over the course of the 20th century and into 2010, relative to that historical time period. Places which are red are places where species numbers have increased. And remember that these are not projected statistical results, these are anchored by specific biological observation. It is only by looking at the temporal difference that you can detect the interaction between land use change and habitat loss. You don't see these big-scale losses of biological diversity attributable to these aspects of global change until you begin to consider biological diversity differences relative to that baseline condition. And that's one of the things that we have tried to be very, very cautious about with this research, the use of baseline conditions. And all measurements of biological diversity here, and this is a really important point, are made relative to the same starting position with species numbers. So we don't include new species that arrive only recently. We are looking at differences with respect to the species that we started with at the beginning of the 20th century. If we had included species that had arrived in southern Canada and that were not part of that early time period, this picture would be different, and we would have failed to detect that biological diversity is actually declining, that species numbers are going down in places where there is this negative interaction between land use change and climate change. And from my point of view, this is something that is very easy to lose sight of in biodiversity research, which is looking at temporal shifts in spatial patterns. If you lose sight of the baseline condition, you are at risk of washing out critical signals which would change the conservation lessons to be learned from those data. Okay, so In our case, in Canada, warming summer temperatures then have interacted with land use changes to apparently cause local species losses. We have had some species from southern Canada go extinct over this time period. That is extinct from Canada. The word we use in Canada for this is extirpated, which is not a word that's, as near as I can tell, in wide use. So I'll use extinction to mean extinction from Canada. But more commonly than this is that many of these species are still present. It's just that they are becoming more rare. And the consequence of this is that the rare species are getting rarer while the common species appear to be largely expanding their range. So hidden under the hood of our observations here is a widespread trend for biotic homogenization, where rare species disappear and common species become increasingly abundant and found in geographically broader areas. We think that these results likely reflect some of the challenges that habitat losses create in terms of achieving successful behavioral thermoregulation. There is very good evidence to suggest that behavioral thermoregulation is a challenge for species under the best of circumstances in the hot continental climates that we have during our summer months. Something that is, I guess, not widely appreciated about Canada is that our summer times are really, really hot. I mean, they're actually hotter here than they are in most of the places that I go in the tropics during the summer months. This is just a characteristic of being deeply buried inside a continent. The coastal areas are different, but most of Canada is far away from the moderating influence of marine conditions. The result being we get really hot, dry conditions in the summertime, and in the absence of heterogeneous natural landscapes, which we are seeing less and less of in southern Canada, it's hard for many species to behaviorally thermoregulate. There was a really neat paper by Jan Sunday on this in Proceedings of the National Academy this year, showing that this issue can indeed limit species, ectotherms especially, at broad scales. We also think that there may be additional indirect effects through things like loss of host plants or the effective presence of host plants, which is to say that if it's too hot, the nectar sources dry up. This has been a documented cause of extinction for at least 1 or 2 butterflies that we lost in the last 20 years in Canada during hot, dry spells that are increasingly common here. So the other part of the work that I wanted to look at here has to do with bumblebee research, and this is based on really huge, expansive data sets across continents, both Europe and North America. And what we are looking at here is, and this is in collaboration with a great many authors who've been just sort of supernaturally amazing at assembling and curating bumblebee observations over long periods of time. What we're trying to do here is measure the extent to which the geographical distributions of bumblebee species across continents have begun to show some signal with respect to changing climatic conditions. We have, as part of this, also examined other factors, other global change drivers that are widely implicated as potential causes of bumblebee collapse. And of course, the subtext for dealing with this issue of bumblebees and climate change is that they're in trouble in a lot of places in both Europe and North America. Some of these species have gone from really common to really rare over 25 or 30 years of time, and this has led to, among other bee species having problems, widespread concern about things like pollinator collapse. So failures of ecosystem services, of course, are part of what is motivating people's specific concerns about groups like bees. So we're going to look at one of those groups here, which is just the genus Bombus, and it's going to be that subset of Bombus species or bumblebee species across Europe and North America for which we have comprehensively detailed sampling information going back to the beginning of the 20th century, so from at least 1901. And this is for about 67 species, around about 420,000 observations. So it's a pretty intensively collected group across this geographical space. And what this map shows in the same sort of way that the butterfly does is places where those specimens have been collected from. Sometimes these dots correspond to an observation of an individual species. You can see that some of our northern areas are not very well collected in Canada. And sometimes these dots correspond to a large number of observations where people have basically gone and surveyed everything about bumblebees at one or more points in time. And I'll just make a note, again parenthetically here, that these remote areas of northern Canada, if you look at the left hand of these two maps, people don't spend a lot of time up in the tundra looking for bumblebees, and it's not actually because there are no bumblebees of any sort there, it's just that getting there is challenging, might be a good way to put it, and incredibly expensive and incredibly dangerous. So collections there are infrequent. So we didn't look at any species whose geographical ranges extend into places where we couldn't tell what was going on because sampling is too poor. So just understand that although sampling in the north is bad, that's not part of our study. What we did here was we looked at the historical latitudinal range and what I'll call the realized thermal niche limits for these species in this baseline period, which is prior to most anthropogenic climate change. For those of you, many of you who understand the details of and timing and magnitude of anthropogenic climate change, you'll know that it was detectable prior to 1974, but not strongly present. So there's maybe a third of a degree at a global scale which is detectably attributable to human impacts, but most of that human impact has come subsequent to that time. And in climate space, to look at what's going on in Canada, things have gone quite crazy in terms of rates of change in the last 35 years. The rate of change is now, well, it's terrifying. And what we've done then is we've measured in the same sort of way as we did with butterflies with respect to these baseline observations, which are a reasonable depiction of baseline, the best that's possible. We've looked at 3 subsequent time periods. And what we did was we simply imposed the expectation that if these bees are doing things like what most butterflies seem to be doing, then their poleward ranges would be expanding north, that they would be tracking to some degree, shifting thermal conditions along their range boundaries. The result would be that in geographical space we would be able to see a change in where they are geographically, and we should expect to see no change in where they are in temperature space through time, assuming they're actually following climate. And the question is, of course, are they doing so? And that's the question that we'll set out to answer rather briefly over the course of a very small number of slides, just summarizing a big study. So we expected tracking, and the question is whether or not we saw it. I will add that we had looked in this study also at the additional factors of things like land use change over the 20th century across both continents using relatively highly resolved information that measures very general trends. It's not like satellite data at all. And we also looked for things like the phylogenetic signal and possible evidence of conservatism in niche space of thermal constraints among species. And so there's a whole section of this work which is based on a molecular phylogeny and uses phylogenetic comparative methods to evaluate mechanisms that we anticipated should be important in determining bumblebee responses. Here are some of the results that we can talk about. If you look at these graphs, one of the things you'll see, so on the left-hand side, we've got this in terms of the geographical distributions of either the hot or equatorward margins of species distributions. So that is in niche space, what we'll call niche space just as a shorthand thing, or their southern latitudinal limits. That's on the left. That's the hot or equatorward margins. And what this shows you is what the bumblebees have done relative to the expectation that they would track the changes that have unfolded subsequent to that baseline period. So the one-to-one line is the dotted line. And that shows you where species ought to be if they had all stayed in just the same place. The right-hand graphs show two of the results, but on the opposite side of niche space and on the opposite side of their geographical ranges. And what they show is on the top right-hand side, things like the cold margins of species ranges, or the poleward, especially the poleward latitudinal limits of these species, haven't shifted at all. So you can look at the residuals first, but the overall trend, which is completely consistent between North America and Europe, is that there has been no geographical displacement, systematically speaking, among bumblebee species on either continent, and there is no difference in how they've responded on either continent to this observed warming through this time. The result of this, if you look at the bottom right-hand graph, is that they are accumulating rather a large climate debt. So although climate is warming, they haven't moved at all as an assemblage, in the sense that there's no statistical trend for successful tracking here. The result is that they've accumulated about 2.5 degrees Celsius of climate debt on the poleward edge of their margin, of their range margin. And that's probably not a good thing, right? Because we expected, really expected, that bumblebee species would have been doing what so many other taxa have been very ably documented as doing, and that is expanding their ranges poleward. And although some species may have shifted north, other species may have shifted south, the net effect is there is no trend towards actual tracking, and that seems like not a very happy result for bumblebees. On the other side of the equation, however, there is evidence that there is range loss from the southern margins of species, and so that's the top left-hand graph, which shows that across continents there is no distinguishable continental effect here, which is why there's a solid black line joining all of the data, the different colors of points representing different continents, where we have, and each point represents the species observations based on a certain number of observations from the limits of the geographical ranges. The upshot of which is to say that along their southern range margins, if you track this back to the intercept, these species have lost hundreds of kilometers as a group from their southern range margins. They are not benefiting in any detectable way from climate change, and I would argue that we have evidence here that, independent of other factors which are incontrovertibly at times going to matter for species, these species are not doing well in a time of rapid climate change, and indeed may be undergoing climate-related losses while incurring climate debts on the opposite sides of those geographical ranges. And I'll add here that, somewhat controversially, we have detailed data on the use of pesticides across the United States for the whole period that neonicotinoids have existed as a commercially applied substance in agricultural areas. Bumblebees are not disappearing from places where neonicotinoid use is heavy. They are not responding at broad, this is important, broad geographical scales to the applications of neonicotinoids in any way that we could detect statistically. We are not measuring population sizes. We are measuring geographical boundaries or boundaries in thermal niche space. And at that level, we do not see that there could be anything here like a hidden effect of neonics. So although most of this analysis looks at cross-continental comparisons, this analysis of just pesticide and neonic use is only for the United States. And the reason for this is that this is the place for which we could get convincing time series, spatially detailed information on the application of pesticides, including all of them, there's like 200 of them, and neonicotinoids in particular. And that effect, the effects that we've observed here that are relative to changing climates, cannot be attributed to neonicotinoid or pesticide use. And this is contrary to what I think at this point is a widespread expectation that bumblebees are disappearing because of neonics, and this has been a long and controversial series of arguments that have been put forward. There's no doubt that neonics can kill bees and indeed the other insects that they are designed to kill. The question is whether or not those effects at local scales scale up to create broad-scale trends in the disappearance of pollinators. We have evidence to suggest that climate could be contributing to this effect. We do not have evidence to suggest that neonics could be. So there's a lot going on here, and I'm summarizing, if you'll forgive me, a rather expansive scientific study and glossing over a lot of the results just because the detail level required to get into it is too much. But if you have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. So I want to just begin to draw things together here. Climate change and land use change appear to be interacting across large areas in Canada to cause butterfly species declines in the most diverse places that are also the most disturbed landscapes in this country. Detecting this effect requires that we have a lot of data that has typically been difficult for ecologists to get. This is long-term biodiversity observation sets that are spatially detailed and that extend over century timescales. We also need to have and need to maintain data sets which bring together measurements of human impacts on landscapes relative to baseline conditions. And what this means is that we can avoid the shifting baseline problem when we look at how global change alters the distribution and abundance of species. But if we lose sight of that baseline, our capacity to measure human impacts on biodiversity is just washes out in a way which means that we may miss some really important things that are clearly going on, but that have eluded us, at least in terms of things like that we think we know about butterflies in Canada, that have eluded us until we started doing comparisons with baseline measurements and also climate baseline data. And I'll add parenthetically here again that our Canadian government is ditching a lot of its environmental monitoring programs, and climate is on the chopping block as well. It just baffles me how this can possibly be what we're doing, but we are at a federal level, and it's just part of a generalized war on science. I'll also add that homogenization and loss of natural habitats reduces the availability of what we might think of as micro-refugia and landscapes that are going to facilitate behavioral thermal regulation. There are good reasons to think that this is a plausible mechanism. Whether it's true is a different matter, but it is certainly an excellent, plausible mechanism that could be a critical reason why maintaining heterogeneous landscapes in a time of rapid climate change is an important thing to do. This is particularly crucial in places like southern Canada and indeed the US and across much of Europe, where summertime temperatures can reach levels which just kill things if they are not able to find those places for behavioral thermoregulation success. In Canada, we need to continue our efforts to conserve wilderness. We've been working really hard on this, but it's a constant fight because they provide habitat refugia and because the trends in terms of biological diversity there versus places where human footprints are deep are just different. If we're going to mitigate otherwise negative impacts of climate change interactions with land use change, we're going to need to keep places where land use changes are at least minimized. In terms of the bumblebee species story, they're just not expanding poleward here, and we are losing populations from their southernmost localities. This is a very, from our point of view, very unexpected result, and it's different than almost anything else. And since bumblebees do things in ecosystems vis-a-vis pollination that are distinctive relative to even other pollinator groups, having the possibility of climate change impacts on bumblebees across continents is something that ought to be of interest to people who are concerned with the related issue of maintenance of ecosystem services. The origins of bumblebees are really weird relative to the groups that have begun to respond in ways that are at least partially favorable to climate change, and that is that they have originated in cool temperate climates unlike butterflies, for example, which are tropical origin species and that at their poleward margins benefit from climate change. They expand their geographical distributions in the absence of other factors. Bumblebee species don't do this, and they originate in places that are quite different. It appears that they are close to the boundaries of their thermal safety limits in terms of the geography of those species. Their ranges are close to the margins of what they can really handle through time. And this appears to be borne out by a number of observations from our study and indeed from some localized studies in other places. So I guess I'll conclude. Climate change-related losses are underway among pollinators. They are not proceeding slowly. They are proceeding quickly, but they're not easy to detect in the absence of long-term, relatively intensive biodiversity data sets. It's more important than ever that we should maintain and add to those data sets through time. We have to be really careful not to lose sight of what the baseline actually is. Now, while losses among butterfly species are unlikely to cause serious problems in ecosystem services in places like Canada, bumblebee losses probably could. And if that's happening because of climate change, then I think we should pay attention to issues of that sort. So we have some possibilities in terms of mechanisms that could explain these results. We are really excited about this research. There's a lot going on here that I haven't been able to speak about, but I hope that at least some of these, hopefully viewed as insights, some of the things that I've talked about today, make the case that maintaining long-term biological data sets containing enormous numbers of observations are vital for us to understand how global change is going to impact species, and may also be relevant to understanding their impacts on the provision of ecosystem services. And with that, I will wrap up, and if you've managed to stay with me so far and sent in questions, I will do my best to respond to those also.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was very neat. In fact, it was very relevant to some things that some colleagues and I have been working on in recent weeks and months. So that was perfectly timed for me to get some benefit out of this, to get a view of your thinking. Everybody in the audience, there's the email address for sending questions. So please, if you have questions, send them to us as soon as you can, so that you can hear Jeremy's response. Jeremy, I'll throw a question at you. It's a very practical question, but I'd just be interested in your thoughts about it. The butterfly and bumblebee data sets that you've used are really rich and really exciting data sets. And also, unfortunately, as you emphasized at the end of your talk, they're very unique, which is to say there aren't a lot of places around the world where you could do this work. Do we get more value or more opportunity if one were to be able to use essentially just before and after snapshots versus truly longitudinal data? Can you kind of comment on that a bit?
Do we get more value out of truly longitudinal data? So if what you mean by that is something like the breeding bird survey, where it's year in, year out, every year, that's what you mean specifically?
Well, I'm actually asking the question the other way around. I'm asking, are there more places on Earth that would open up to this sort of analysis if you don't need the truly longitudinal data, and instead you could say, before 1970 and after 2010, something like that?
Yeah. Yes. So I think the answer to that question is yes. This doesn't mean that it will make it easier, but it's not going to make it easy. You really have to have a decent data set available somehow to accomplish this. the availability of historical observations from natural history collections, obviously you've done a lot of work on those sorts of data sets. Those kinds of data sets have a lot more power than I think the disciplines that we all work in have yet realized in a collective sense. I think many individuals use these data sets routinely and really get it that you can accomplish a lot theoretically, you can accomplish a lot practically with those kinds of data sets. But there are certainly immense amounts of progress that can be achieved by putting those data sets into some sort of a digital form in places where we have not yet made much progress with them. We've seen lots of good evidence that this is indeed the case. And if you look at some of the research, I mean, we'll talk about Europe, for example, and then we compare it with what we can do in terms of the Canadian data. It's just appalling, the differences as a Canadian when I look at what the Europeans have assembled. It's like everybody and their uncle is a natural history collector, and there's these oceans of data, but it's only in the last 10 or 12 years or so that historical observations have been put together with recent observations, irrespective of the degree to which observations are continuous, to measure difference, and we've seen seminal contributions emerge as a consequence. Those sorts of endeavors can be achieved in other places as well, and I think it would be particularly valuable for us to try to bring together, at least for groups that are reasonably well collected, historical baseline information for some tropical places where these things are more achievable. It's going to be hard to do. Like, we couldn't do the butterfly work for all butterflies as we did in Canada. We couldn't do this in Brazil, for example, because nobody really knows what the geographical distribution of a lot of those species are across much of that country. There's just too much cool stuff going on. But we could make a lot more progress than we have been for at least some groups. So I think that this is an untapped, not an untapped, but relative to our opportunity, an insufficiently tapped way of mobilizing historical observations that are, even now with entities like GBIF and the other endeavors that are doing similar sorts of things, even now a lot of those observations are sitting in quiet little corners of dusty museums, not really bringing life to science on a day-to-day basis. And I think it's a tragic lost opportunity. And also, we don't have a lot of time to deal with some of these problems in a sensible way, and I think we'd better continue working rather hard to get our act together.
I think that's a really good point. One thing is essentially the dormant data problem, where there are major institutions that haven't digitized or haven't shared their data. But then there's another point that you mentioned, and it's too important not to repeat it, which is strategic mobilization of data, where, if we're thinking old versus new, to keep it very simple, you might have the old but not the new. Well, at least for certain groups, mobilizing observational data is a powerful and pretty quick way of dealing with that. And on the other hand, sometimes you have the new and not the old, and then the question is, are there rich historical data sets, usually specimens, that could be mobilized? And so that kind of strategic thinking about maximizing the learning yield from what data exists, that's so crucial to really making this field come alive.
I agree. I think you've nailed it. This is really important. We've got to get this moving. And I shouldn't, when I say we've got to get it moving, I don't mean to imply that it isn't moving. I think that there is now serious recognition that these data exist, that these data can provide insights. But I would like to encourage continued growth in terms of our putting together data sets that give us a view of where we're coming from with respect to biodiversity change. I think in terms of dealing with that issue, we have made a lot of progress, but that there is a lot of progress yet to make. And a lot of that progress needs to be made quickly, or we're going to have shifted away from those baseline conditions in a way which is irrevocable and consequential. Things that happen when you lose pollinator species, for example, it might be important to keep pollinators. This is a point which I think will be obvious to biology people, but it's just astonishing when you try to make this case sometimes to policy people. I'm like, well, how many bees do we need? Well, the right answer is, it actually, if we wanted to be just brass tacks about this, it may well be that the right answer is not all of them, but it's for purely service provision. But it's certainly more than one of them. Just honeybees is probably not going to cut the mustard here. We really need to be doing a much better job of holding on to what we started with, and part of that task is going to be facilitated by knowing what we started with. And that's one of the roles for historical data. It's so fundamental, it doesn't require a theoretical insight. It's not an analysis-based thing particularly. It's just knowing what you started with and measuring difference relative to that point, and not measuring difference relative to what we had 5 years ago as a starting point, because that's rewriting biodiversity history. And I think that will mislead understanding of human impacts.
Well, thank you very, very much. Essentially what you've done is given a very, very deep motivation to a lot of the broader efforts in the field of biodiversity informatics. Essentially,
there's a lot of good work out there.
Well, there are people who are, totally in the trenches on data capture or data quality, and this seminar does a very nice job of illustrating why. So, Jeremy, I'm not seeing any questions coming in, which is common with these seminars. There's just a little bit too much of a delay in people getting questions sent.
It's no problem. We can do that offline later if any come in at another time.
Well, thank you very much for a chunk of your morning and for your insight, and my thanks.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, Town. This was a great, fun thing to do, and I love the format. This is a good idea.
A pleasure. Thanks again. Take care.
Okay. Bye for now.
All right.